All right, I've got a rant brewing and I've got Ghost Chips Ahoy protein yet again. We're going to go in here to my recording setup and we're going to talk about triggers. All right, got a little bit better lighting. I can get on with the rant. I've got a little bit of Case of the Mondays today, hence the rant, but I'm going to put you here on the case. We can talk about some triggers. I'll show you some. We'll kind of get into it. Now, two things I'll say about it before I even really get into the bulk of this stuff is, number one, it seems like people really love to overemphasize and over-obsess about triggers, how they feel, what the poundage is, the weight, and all that stuff. And in my estimation and in my experience, it just doesn't really matter as much as everybody likes to make it out to be. The trigger is not the thing that's holding you back. The trigger, the way it feels, the poundage is not the reason you're missing 99.9% of the time. And the number 2 point I'll make is usually when people talk about a good trigger, what they mean is it's a light trigger. And again, in my experience, light triggers are not necessarily good just because they're light, even though people like to make them out kind of to be. So I'll kind of get into it now. The number one thing is, my number 1 point, the trigger is not the thing that's holding you back. What I mean by that is, like, people love to overemphasize the importance of how a trigger feels, what the weight and stuff is. If they had a lighter trigger, they would be more accurate, this kind of stuff. I think it kind of actually comes from the like the Instagram instructor kind of world, kind of a few years ago when there was like all these tactical guys that showed up and they're like, here's a very particular way to interact with the trigger that'll make you more accurate. And people love to over obsess about being able to pull it straight to the rear. And if you have a lighter trigger and a less gritty trigger, then you could probably be able to do that better. The issue, though, is that in my experience, that's not even the problem. People being able to, like, people love to talk about if you don't have enough trigger finger on the trigger, then you're going to be pushing on it. If you have too much, you're going to be pulling on it. And again, like, to a certain extent, that's true. You want to pull it straight to the rear. But then people love to talk about how if it's heavy, then you're going to have a harder time pulling it to the rear. And maybe to a certain extent, that's true. But in my experience, what people are having a problem with isn't even necessarily the trigger pull itself. It's that they're trying to shoot the gun with their entire hand. So I can get people online to, I can get people to do trigger control at speed where we're not touching the trigger, and I just want you to roll through the pressure. So just do this and not actually move the gun at all. And I can get them like, we're just going to roll through the pressure and break the trigger without moving the gun at all. And people can do this all day long and hit what they're trying to hit and interact with the trigger in a pretty aggressive way, pretty fast. So the trigger weight and the grittiness of like a stock Glock trigger, not the issue. And then when we get people on longer, faster strings of fire, then they start having problems with the sympathetic movement in their hands. So like if I try to just move my index finger, my middle finger will move. To a certain extent, my thumb, if I try to run it really aggressively, my thumb will start doing it. So people start having problems with this. Now there are ways to get around it, ways to kind of mitigate that. Like people love to talk about, you know, if you're gripping properly with your support hand, then the sympathetic movement will not affect the sights as much, or if at all, which is true to a certain amount. But if your support hand starts to kind of give up, then now you're going to start seeing it, which is kind of what happens when you, like, people will notice, oh, my first 3 rounds are good. They go where I want them to, but fourth, fifth, and sixth rounds are starting, and it's starting to go away. And it's because they're giving up a little bit of grip with their support hand, and that starts to kind of give up and get a little bit loose. And now they can move the gun when they're pulling it with their whole hand, versus if I clamp down like I'm supposed to, now not as much. So that's kind of a way to get around it. I think it's kind of putting a Band-Aid over the problem, but that is a method. Now, again, the trigger itself, not really the thing that's holding you back. What I will say, though, is that if you have something with longer travel, like usually Glocks and to a certain extent Smith & Wessons are notorious for having a lot of pre-travel and a lot of travel into the break. you'll have more opportunity, sort of, to impart some sympathetic movement. So having a trigger with less travel, no matter the weight, would probably be better. If I was to give you like, here's what I think a good trigger would be. But again, there are people shooting stock-ish Glock triggers at an extremely high level, podium finishing on a national level. So like there are much bigger things at play here than the amount of travel or the weight of a trigger. That much bigger things that have to do with consistency and durability of your grip and your vision focus, and if you're in competition setting, your movement and things like that. So that's kind of my estimation of it. Now, I think there's some, like the Instagram instructors and like all the tactical guys and stuff that really had this extremely specific technique on how to pull a trigger, which, by the way, I hate anything that's like, here's a very specific technique to get you to do a thing. And they love to talk about Glock triggers, and like, if you can see it here in the light, where, so here's the pre-travel of a Glock trigger, this much, right? And then if you press just a little bit of pressure, it'll kind of go to like a second wall. So like you have the pre-travel to the wall, a little bit more pressure, it'll go to another wall, little bit more pressure, it'll kind of go to another wall, and then it'll break. And they love to point this out and be like, see, so there's all this little hitches and catches in a Glock trigger. You have the wall, you have kind of another wall, kind of another wall, and then it'll break. And it's like, oh, look at all these hitches and catches. Well, that's a bad trigger. And it's like, well, so that's not even how anybody interacts with a trigger if we're doing it in a pretty aggressive way. Like, I'm just rolling through all of that in the first place. So it doesn't even matter. Like, we're just rolling through all the pressure. And I've said before, I like a trigger that has a wall and something to break through. Not because I prep press triggers. Like, this is kind of the prep press kind of crowd where they're like, you prep the trigger to the wall and then you press really deliberately and slowly and let the gun surprise you. And, you know, if you're doing it that way, which again, I think is an extremely wrong way to do it. I think anybody that teaches that is kind of a moron, but that's not how you're going to interact with a trigger in like a self-defense situation or a competition setting or anything. And so I like a trigger that has a wall, not because I prep press, but because I just kind of like the way it feels, and I'm really used to triggers feeling that way. And so it gives me something to like roll pressure through, I guess, so I can kind of just not go to the wall, like not prepping to the wall, but I can kind of like roll through the wall, if that makes any kind of sense. Like, I'm rolling through all of this anyway, just stacking pressure as I go along. Now, I like something that has a wall, but that doesn't really have anything to do with how I interact with it. Like, I'm still just pulling through the entire thing. But all of that grit that's in there, like all of the little extra little hitches and catches, that I don't even notice the way I interact with the trigger. And when you get people talking about this stuff, it's like, you don't notice it when you're shooting a bill drill. If I told you from a draw, try to shoot a bill drill in under 2 seconds, you would not notice any of those little hitches and catches. Now, the Glock performance triggers are, instead of like 5.5 pounds, they are 4.5, I think. And they feel a little bit better, but still, like, here's the wall. It kind of squishes a little bit more than a stock Glock trigger because it's lighter, but there's not, and this gun has had, so the difference between these guns is like, this gun has had thousands and thousands and thousands of rounds through it. This gun has had like 150, so the trigger will smooth out over time. But on this thing, like, you have a little bit of grittiness and squish, but it breaks through that wall. And if I'm actually interacting with the trigger the way that I do at speed, like, I just pull straight through. Now, I will say, in a rare turn of events, or a good turn of events, or something, like, I got the PDP. I'll just say that. No turn of events, I just got a PDP. This has an excellent striker fired trigger. It has a wall. I think these are like 4 pounds or something like that. and there's almost no grit and almost no travel. It just a little bit, like a millimeter, and then it breaks. And I like it a lot. And it's flat faced and all that, but you have a wall, it travels just a little bit, like a millimeter, and then it breaks. And the break, if I can show you the difference between the two, like this break has a lot of travel compared to this break, where it doesn't seem like there's as much. So in my estimation, like, even though this and this are the same trigger weight, this one is better because it has less travel. But what I would say is, like, if this was heavier, like if this was a 5.5 pound trigger, like the stock Glock trigger, I would still probably say this is better than the 4.5 pound because of the way it breaks and the amount of travel that it has. But again, like, people really love to over obsess about the weight of a trigger and how it feels, when if I'm really like comparing the two, the amount of travel, I don't even notice. Like the way I interact with the trigger is I just pull through, it'll reset. And I usually, like, if I'm running it fast, I'm coming all the way out and I'm coming right back in, and I run it really fast and it's pretty accurate. And the thing that I'll say is, like, the trigger weight and how it feels doesn't matter as much as being able to control your hands while, like, the hand pressure while it happens, and your vision focus. Because it doesn't matter what a trigger feels like or how many pounds it is. If you have a 1 pound trigger with a millimeter of travel and you're focused right on the dot and watching it bounce everywhere, your hits are still going to look like trash. So, like, there are much bigger things at play here than how the trigger actually feels. And that's kind of the rant for today, talking about this stuff. But, like, people love to talk about Glock triggers, that this has so much grit and travel. It's like, you don't notice it when you're interacting with a trigger. If we actually shot defensive style drills, you would never notice any of that stuff. So why are we even talking about it? That's kind of the rant for today. Just like case of the Mondays a little bit. So anyway, I'm going to get on to some dry fire. Maybe I'll release this as like a series or something, like Case of the Mondays, and start doing some rants about different training things and topics, things like that. But anyway, have a good one. See you in the next one. Like and comment, all that kind of stuff. Thank you.